So we're continuing with our discussion of printmaking. This is Unit 7, and the art media that we're covering in Unit 7 is printmaking. And so we just covered relief printmaking, and now we're talking about our first type of intaglio print. Intaglio is the main word that covers all the basic types of printing that work with metal plates, and the one thing that they all have in common is that the scratches that are made into the metal plate are very, very fine and sharp scratches, and they function exactly the opposite to the way carving a woodblock functions, right? Carving in a woodblock, everywhere you carve becomes the white area because it doesn't hold ink. And in any kind of intaglio, everywhere that you scratch into the surface of a metal plate, then what you do is when you're done, you ink the whole plate and then you wipe away the whole plate so that all the top surface of the plate is clean, doesn't have any ink on it whatsoever. So this area here would have had no marks on it. But all of these areas, which were hand marked, all of those areas will then hold the ink, because those little tiny scratches into the surface of metal, they actually hold the ink, and that ink doesn't come out until it's pressed in a very strong press. A press, I think I kind of covered this, but a press is a machine, like a big wheel, that runs the plate and the paper through and puts a whole lot of pressure on them to press the ink on from the plate or from the matrix onto the paper. And when you're doing intaglio print, you have to have a lot of pressure in order to make that work. Okay, so engraving is in some ways the simplest form. Maybe dry point would be even simpler. Engraving is the simplest form of intaglio in that the marks are made by hand. Unlike intaglio, unlike dry point. In dry point, the marks aren't very deep, and it's the burr of the mark making, the kind of slightly raised edge burr, that is the thing that holds the ink, and therefore with dry point you can't make a lot of prints out of a dry point plate. But engraving is, you do use a special tool to make a pretty deep cut into the plate, and you have to use a whole lot of pressure. You have to be very strong to do this, and you carve these deep marks that make permanent indentions into the plate that will hold the ink, and you can make really large numbers of additions out of this. So this is done by just the sheer force of strength. I often tell people to think of the genius of Dürer. I mean, Dürer was an amazing artist in so many ways, but just his ability to make a plate like this, you have to think of him as having like the strength of a football player and the grace of a ballerina, and the eye of one of the greatest artists of all time. Now, etching is another form of intaglio, and it takes a lot of the heavy physical work out of the process, because instead of your body being the thing that makes those deep carved-in lines, it is an etching process, using acid to carve the lines in. The way it works is you have a plate. Let's say this plate was blank at first, and then it's covered with a ground, which is kind of like a rubbery material. And then you come in with a stylus, a sharp metal tool, to scratch lines into it. And everywhere you scratch lines, right, you're not really scratching the plate much, you're just scratching the ground away, exposing the plate. And then once you've done your drawing, you then put the plate into an acid bath. And the acid literally starts carving into the metal, starts eating it out. Everywhere where the ground is, it doesn't touch the metal at all. But everywhere that you made a line, it starts carving a deep line. And so one of the things you can see is, so besides the obvious, which is that it's not nearly as hard on the muscles of your shoulders and your arms, another advantage of etching is that you can get really, really deep, dark, saturated darks. And then another beautiful advantage of etching that someone like Rembrandt discovered, and other artists of his period, is that you can use this process to kind of like to build your idea and to change your idea as you go. So that Rembrandt would he would draw on his plate, and he would make decisions, and carve those lines into the ground, and then he would etch it with the acid, and then he would print it and test it and see what he liked, and then he would make decisions about things he wanted to change, and he would do more so he could get some lines darker or some lines lighter. If he thought that some lines were needed to be lightened, he could maybe sand the plate back to decrease those lines, and he could keep working on that plate until he was absolutely satisfied with it. See, like that. Look at that. And so here you can see his initial drawing of what he thought the plate was going to look like, and then his decision to basically just to grind all of that out and to make a big flat wall there, and then to change it so that, but you can still see traces of some of the other stuff that was underneath. Okay, so one of the things that, from a technical point of view, the printmakers and artists were looking for was with the with intaglio prints was more and more abilities to create variation of tone and soft, subtle changes of tone. Let's go back for a second. Rembrandt was able to make a lot of really subtle changes of light and dark, but part of that was because he was pretty experimental in the way he inked plates. He inked plates so that he purposely put more ink in some areas and less ink in others, and then he wiped away more in some areas and wiped away less in others. You can see that like right there, the way he especially wiped away a little bit more just to bring a little bit more light to that head. But this was challenging because part of the point of printmaking was to get all of your prints to be exactly the same, and if you had to rely on a printer to wipe away, to ink and wipe away in such a very unique kind of manner, it raised the possibility that they would just mess it up. So there was an effort to find processes that could give you lots of really soft tones, and that no matter how the inker and the printer did it, they basically would do it fine, and you'd get all those variations of tone. So Mezzotint is one of those methods that was developed, and it's basically just like, well, it's not just like, but it's a form of intaglio. What you do is you get a plate like an etching plate, only you don't put a don't put a ground on it. Instead, you take a thing called a rocker, which is a metal tool that has teeth on it, and it literally rocks back and forth, and you rock it over the plate over and over again. It's like a big kind of metal arch with a handle. And as you go back and forth, that arc with the teeth, it keeps making more and more bites into the plate, making small little cuts. And you essentially cover the entire plate with as many cuts as possible. The way this process worked for a lot of people was you hired someone to do this for you, and then you sand back the plate. Anywhere that you want light, you sand it to remove those lines, and everywhere you want it to be the darkest value, you don't sand at all. It's kind of a reverse form of intaglio in some ways, in that you get the whole plate super dark first, and then with sandpaper or other kinds of grit, you start removing and adding light. Okay, I'm going to end there. We'll come to